The dust devil spun across the Kansas prairie like a drunken ghost kicking up dried grass and the bones of cattle that hadn't survived the summer drought. Jessie Harlow pulled her hat down low and squinted through the haze, watching the distant riders close in on their quarry. 6 men on horseback, their rifles glinting in the late afternoon sun, pursuing a lone figure whose mount was beginning to stumble on the rocky terrain. "There," Deputy Calloway's voice cracked like a whip across the flatland. "The thieving bastards heading for Willow Creek." Jessie spurred her paint mare forward, her Winchester bouncing against her leg as she rode. At 16, she'd been working cattle for Samuel Garrett long enough to know how to handle both horse and gun. But something about this chase felt wrong. They'd been riding hard for 3 miles based on nothing more than Jake Morrison's word that he'd seen an Indian near his missing horses. No proof, no witnesses, just the kind of quick judgment that passed for justice in their corner of Kansas. She thought about her father, Thomas Harlow, who died 2 years ago from what the doctor called heart failure brought on by stress and overwork. He'd been fighting accusations of being too friendly with the local tribes, defending himself against whispers that he was selling guns to the Indians. The strain had worn him down, made him sick and weak in those final months. She remembered him drinking strange-tasting water from a bottle that Deputy Calloway had brought him, claiming it was medicine from the territorial capital that might help his condition. The fugitive's horse stumbled in a prairie dog hole, sending its rider tumbling across the hardpan. Jessie reined in as the other men dismounted their weapons, trained on the fallen figure. In the dying light, she could see he was young, maybe 25, with long black hair and buckskin clothing torn from his fall. Blood seeped from a bullet wound in his left thigh, dark against the pale earth. "Got you now, you horse-stealing savage." Calloway snarled, his icy gaze gleaming with satisfaction. "Boys, drag that old wagon over here. We'll get some light on this." The men hauled an abandoned settler's wagon from a nearby wash, its broken wheels groaning against the stones. Soon flames licked at the dry wood, casting dancing shadows across the scene. The wounded man, clearly Lakota from his dress and bearing, struggled to sit up, his dark eyes steady despite the pain etched across his weathered face. "I am Wicasa Red Hawk," he said in clear English, his voice calm despite his injury. "I have taken no horses. I was hunting deer when your bullets found me." "Liar." Jake Morrison spat, his face flushed with whiskey and hatred. "All you redskins are thieves? Should string you up right here and save the territory some trouble." Jessie studied the man's face in the flickering glow, searching for deception, but finding only pain and quiet dignity. Something in his steady gaze reminded her of her father, the same unwavering honesty that had made Thomas Harlow so many enemies before his death. "And where's your proof?" She heard herself ask, her voice cutting through the men's angry muttering. "We never found Morrison's horses. Never saw tracks leading from his place to here." Calloway's head snapped toward her, his thin mouth twisting in contempt. "Since when do we need proof to deal with thieving Indians, girl? Your daddy's soft heart rubbed off on you, did it?" The mention of her father sent heat coursing through Jessie's veins. She remembered the day he died, how he'd been clutching his chest and gasping for air, that strange medicine bottle still sitting on his nightstand. She'd asked Calloway about it afterward, but he'd claimed it was just tonic water to help with digestion. "My daddy taught me that evidence matters more than prejudice." She said, her voice level despite the turmoil in her chest. "Your daddy was a fool." Calloway said, his hand moving to rest on a small glass vial in his vest pocket, the same kind of bottle he'd brought her father. "And look where his principles got him, dead in a cold grave, while better men keep this territory safe." The other men began mounting up their bloodlust, satisfied by the sight of the wounded warrior. Morrison swung into his saddle and looked down at Wicasa with disgust. "Leave him for the coyotes. They'll finish what we started." But Jessie remained on her horse, staring down at the wounded man as he pressed his hands against his bleeding leg. the flickering glow reflected in his eyes. And she saw something there that made her chest tighten, the same look her father had worn in his final days when he'd been fighting battles no one else could see. The sound of departing horses faded into the distance, leaving only the crackle of flames and the harsh whisper of wind across the prairie. Jessie sat her horse in the wavering light, her hands gripping the reins until her knuckles went white. Below her, Wicasa Red Hawk had propped himself against a boulder, his breathing labored but steady. "You should go," he said quietly. "Your people will not understand if you stay." Jessie swung down from her horse, her boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. She'd been an orphan for 2 years now, working for wages that barely kept her alive, sleeping in Samuel Garrett's barn loft because she had nowhere else to go. The townspeople tolerated her because she was useful with cattle. But they'd never forgotten that she was Thomas Harlow's daughter, with a man who'd been too friendly with Indians, too willing to question popular opinion. "They've already made it clear I don't belong," she said, kneeling beside the wounded man. The bullet had torn through muscle and sinew, leaving a ragged hole that bled steadily. "But that doesn't mean I have to become like them." She began tearing strips from her shirt, her movements quick and efficient. She'd tended enough injured cattle to know the basics of stopping bleeding, though she'd never worked on a human before. The warrior watched her with wary eyes, clearly unused to kindness from white strangers. "Why?" he asked, as she pressed the makeshift bandage against his wound. He didn't flinch, though she could see the pain in the tight lines around his eyes. "Because my father taught me that every man deserves a chance to prove his innocence." Jessie replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "And because I've seen what happens when people make up their minds about guilt before they know the truth." She thought about her father's final months, how the stress of fighting false accusations had worn him down until his heart simply gave out. At least, that's what everyone said. But she'd always wondered about that strange medicine Calloway had brought him and why her father had seemed to get worse instead of better after drinking it. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. Deputy Calloway emerged from the darkness, his badge catching the light from the burning wagon. His pale blue eyes took in the scene with cold calculation. Jessie kneeling beside the wounded Indian, her hands stained with blood, her shirt torn and disheveled. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "Looks like Thomas Harlow's daughter takes after her daddy. Always did have a soft spot for savages." Jessie rose to her feet, her jaw set in defiance. "His name is Wicasa Red Hawk, and he's bleeding to death. A decent man would get him to a doctor. A decent man would let justice take its course." Calloway replied, his hand unconsciously moving to that small vial in his vest pocket. "This savage stole Morrison's horses, and now he's paying the price. You'd best mount up and head home before folks start thinking you're in league with horse thieves. What evidence do you have?" Jessie demanded, stepping protectively in front of the wounded warrior. "Did you find the stolen horses? Did you see him take them?" The deputy's expression darkened, and his hand moved to rest on his gun butt. "I don't need evidence beyond common sense. Indians are thieves, plain and simple. Always have been. That's not justice." Jessie said, her voice shaking with anger. "That's just hate. Justice is what I say it is in this territory." Calloway snapped. "And I say this savage dies here tonight. Now get on your horse and ride away, or I'll arrest you for aiding a known criminal." Jessie's hand moved to her father's old Colt .45, a worn but reliable weapon that had served Thomas Harlow well. She wasn't fast, not like the gunfighters in the dime novels, but she was accurate, and at this distance, accuracy mattered more than speed. "If you want him dead," she said quietly, "you'll have to kill him yourself right here in front of me. Because I'm not leaving." The deputy's eyes narrowed as he studied her face, searching for weakness. But Jessie had learned early that backing down from bullies only invited more abuse. She'd watched her father stand up to men like Calloway, even when it cost him everything. Behind her, Wicasa Red Hawk struggled to rise, his hand gripping the boulder for support. "Do not risk yourself for me," he said softly. "I am prepared to die." "Well, I'm not prepared to let you," Jessie replied without taking her eyes off Calloway. "Not when you haven't done anything wrong." The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Calloway's hand moved away from his gun, and a cold smile spread across his face. "You know what? Maybe you're right. Maybe I shouldn't shoot him here. Might be better to let the law take its course." He pulled a pair of iron shackles from his saddlebags and tossed them at Jessie's feet. "Put those on him. Both of you are coming with me." As Jessie reluctantly secured the shackles around Wicasa's wrists, she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. In the wavering light, she could see fresh brands on two of the horses grazing nearby Morrison's mark, crude and recent burned over older brands that had been deliberately obscured. Someone had been stealing horses, all right. But it wasn't the wounded Lakota warrior, now leaning heavily against her shoulder. The jail cell reeked of unwashed bodies and despair. Jessie had never seen the inside of the territorial lockup, but she'd heard stories about the summer heat that turned the small space into an oven, and the winter cold that seeped through the stone walls like death itself. Sheriff Mathis had been reluctant to lock her up alongside Wicasa Red Hawk, but Calloway had been persuasive. Easier to keep an eye on them both this way, he'd argued. Besides, if she's fool enough to side with a horse thief, maybe a night in jail will teach her the consequences of poor judgment. Mathis was a weak man, gray-haired and soft around the middle, more concerned with avoiding trouble than pursuing justice. He'd taken one look at the wounded Indian and the defiant girl and decided that following Calloway's lead was the path of least resistance. "Just for tonight?" he'd mumbled, avoiding Jessie's eyes. "We'll sort this out in the morning." But morning felt like a lifetime away as Jessie knelt beside Wicasa on the filthy straw that covered the cell floor. The warrior's breathing had grown shallow, his skin hot and dry to the touch. Infection was setting in, turning his wound from a manageable injury into a potential death sentence. "Water." Jessie called out to the deputy stationed outside their cell. "He needs water, and we need clean cloth for his bandage." The man, a young pockmarked fellow named Pete, barely looked up from his dime novel. "Sheriff says you get what everyone else gets. Nothing special for Indian lovers." Jessie bit back her angry response. Losing her temper wouldn't help Wicasa, and it might make their situation worse. Instead, she tore more strips from her shirt and did what she could with the resources at hand. The makeshift bandage was soaked through with blood and beginning to smell, but removing it might cause more bleeding. "Tell me about the horses," she whispered to Wicasa as she worked. "The ones that have been stolen. Have you seen anything unusual?" The warrior's fever-bright eyes focused on her face. "The thefts began many months ago," he said quietly. "Always at night, always when families were away. The stolen horses appear at auctions in distant towns, their brands changed. Changed how? Burned over with new marks. It takes skill and knowledge of where to sell without questions." Jessie nodded grimly. She'd suspected as much from what she'd seen at the site of their capture. Someone who knows the territory. Someone who understands how the system works. "Yes," Wicasa agreed. "Someone with authority. Someone people trust." They fell silent as Boots approached their cell. Deputy Calloway stood in the doorway, his badge removed, and his sleeves rolled up, looking more like a common criminal than a lawman. "How's our patient?" he asked mockingly. "Still breathing? That's unfortunate. He needs medical attention," Jessie said firmly. "Whatever you think he's done, he deserves a doctor." "Not what I think he's done." Calloway laughed harshly. "Girl, I know what he's done. Been tracking that horse-stealing ring for months. Amazing how all the evidence points back to his people." "What evidence?" Jessie challenged. "You never found any stolen horses. Never caught anyone in the act. Didn't I? Calloway reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. He shook out its contents, $3 silver and a small piece of paper covered with writing. Found these in his saddlebags. Payment for stolen horses along with a list of ranches to hit next. Jessie stared at the planted evidence with growing anger. You're lying. You put those there yourself. Prove it, Calloway said with a shrug. Evidence is evidence. Judge won't care about your feelings when he sees proof of guilt. Wicasa stared at the silver coins with no surprise in his eyes, only resignation. You know the truth, he said quietly to Calloway. You know I am innocent. I know you're a horse thief who got caught, the deputy replied. And I know your accomplice here is going to share your fate unless she comes to her senses. He kicked the silver dollars across the cell floor. Think about it, girl. You can still walk away from this. Tell the judge you were confused, that you didn't know what you were doing. People will understand. I'm not walking away, Jessie said through gritted teeth. Not from him, not from the truth. Then you're a fool, Calloway said, his mask of false reasonableness slipping. And fools don't live long in this territory. As his footsteps faded down the corridor, Jessie felt the full weight of their predicament. They were trapped, framed, and facing execution. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she remembered her father's words about truth having a way of coming out if you were brave enough to keep fighting for it. Outside the jail, she could hear voices gathering in the street, angry voices full of hate and thirsting for blood. The good people of town were working themselves up to something, and she had a sick feeling that she and Wicasa were about to become the main attraction. The voices outside grew louder as the night wore on, fueled by whiskey and the kind of righteous anger that men like to wrap around their darkest impulses. Jessie could hear fragments of conversation through the barred window, calls for immediate justice, complaints about the expense of a trial, suggestions that some crimes were too heinous to wait for a judge. They're going to lynch us, she whispered to Wicasa, who was drifting in and out of consciousness as his fever climbed. Maybe before morning, maybe at first light. Either way, we're not going to see another sunset. The warrior's eyes opened clearer for a moment than they'd been in hours. You should not have helped me, he said softly. I am already dead. You still have a chance. No, Jessie said firmly. Whatever happens, we face it together. A new voice joined the crowd outside Deputy Calloway, his tone reasonable and calming. Now, boys, I understand your anger. Horse theft is a serious crime. But we can't take the law into our own hands. We have to follow proper procedures. Proper procedures, someone shouted back. That savage and his accomplice need hanging. We can't let this stand. Listen to me. Calloway continued, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. I want justice as much as any of you. But if we rush this, we might let other criminals escape. This might be part of a larger conspiracy. Through the window, Jessie could see the crowd growing restless. Men carried torches and rope, their faces twisted with hate and alcohol. The deputy wasn't trying to save them. He was managing the situation, controlling the narrative. Tell you what, Calloway said, his tone becoming more conspiratorial. Why don't you boys get some sleep? Come morning, we'll have a proper trial. And when the evidence shows what I think it shows well, justice will be served. As the crowd began to disperse, Jessie knew their time was running out. She looked around the cell, noting the age of the wood, the rust on the iron bars, the way the lamplight flickered through the small window. An idea began to form, desperate and dangerous, but their only hope. Can you walk? She asked Wicasa. If I must, he replied, struggling to sit up. Then get ready, we're getting out of here. The escape was chaos and flame. Jessie shattered the lamp against the cell wall, spreading burning oil across the old wood. The fire caught quickly, filling the corridor with smoke and panic. In the confusion, she managed to grab the keys from the guard's belt and unlock their cell. Supporting Wicasa between them, they stumbled through the smoke-filled jail toward the rear exit. Shouts and gunshots echoed behind them as the building began to burn in earnest. They emerged into the cool night air just as the roof started to collapse, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. The horses, Jessie gasped, pointing toward the corral behind the jail. We need to get to the horses. They made it to the corral as the first pursuers rounded the building. Jessie helped Wicasa onto the back of the gentlest horse she could find, then mounted her own paint mare. Bullets whistled past their ears as they spurred their horses toward the open prairie, the burning jail lighting the night behind them. The pursuit followed quickly, but Jessie knew the country better than most. She led them through rocky gullies and across creek beds, using every trick her father had taught her about evading trackers in difficult terrain. By dawn, they had reached the Badlands, a harsh landscape of stone spires and hidden canyons where a small group could hide from a larger force. They took refuge in a narrow canyon where stunted juniper trees provided meager shade. Wicasa's fever had broken, but his wounded leg left him barely able to walk. Jessie's own injuries, cuts from flying glass burns from the flames, throbbed with each heartbeat. We can't stay here long, she said, scanning the canyon walls for signs of pursuit. Calloway will have men searching every hiding place. Yes. Wicasa agreed, his voice stronger than it had been since the shooting. But before we move, there is something you must know. Something that changes everything. What is it? Wicasa was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face. I lied to you about why I was in that place when your posse found me. I was not hunting deer. Then what were you doing? I was meeting with someone, he said carefully. Someone who had been investigating the horse thefts, someone who discovered the truth about who was really behind them. Jessie felt her heart skip a beat. Who? Your father. The words hit her like a physical blow. What, that's impossible. My father died 2 years ago. Thomas Harlow did die 2 years ago, Wicasa confirmed. But not from a weak heart, as people believe. He was murdered because he discovered the truth about the horse thefts. And what truth? Jessie whispered, though part of her already knew. Your father was a careful man, suspicious of quick accusations. When horses began disappearing, he noticed things others missed. Brands that had been altered, auction records that didn't match patterns that suggested inside knowledge. He came to me because he believed my people were being blamed for crimes they did not commit. Wicasa shifted against the canyon wall, wincing as his movement jarred his wounded leg. He discovered that the horse thefts were being organized by someone with authority. Someone who could move freely, alter documents, control investigations. Deputy Calloway. Yes, but there was more. Your father learned that Calloway was not the man he claimed to be. They had known each other years ago, before Calloway came to this territory. They had been friends once, partners, even working together on a ranch in Colorado. The revelation struck Jessie like lightning. My father never mentioned knowing Calloway before, because he was ashamed. Wicasa said gently. Calloway had been different then, younger, more idealistic. They had worked together, dreamed of making something of themselves. But Calloway chose the easy path, the criminal path. Your father chose honor instead. And Calloway killed him for it. Yes, but not quickly. Your father suspected he was being slowly poisoned when he began feeling sick after drinking the medicine Calloway brought him. He had samples of his food and water tested by a doctor in the territorial capital. The results proved he was being given arsenic administered in small doses over many months to make it appear like natural heart failure. Jessie thought about that strange tasting water, the mysterious medicine bottles, the way her father had seemed to get worse instead of better. That's why he was so sick before he died. It wasn't stress, it was poison. Your father was dying, but he used his remaining time to gather evidence. In our final meeting, he gave me something proof that would expose the entire conspiracy. What kind of evidence? A ledger hidden in an old line shack in the foothills. It contains records of every stolen horse, every altered brand, every payoff to accomplices. But more than that, it contains his letter explaining everything he discovered, including the medical reports proving he was being murdered. Jessie stared at him, hope and disbelief warring in her chest. Why didn't you retrieve it? Why didn't you expose him? Because I am Indian, Wicasa said simply. Who would believe me your father knew this? He said if anything happened to him, I should wait for the right moment, the right ally. At the line shack. Jessie said, her voice hoarse with emotion. Where is it? The northeast of here in the foothills below Eagle's Peak. It's well hidden, abandoned for years. But the journey is dangerous. Calloway's men are searching for us, and the terrain is treacherous. Jessie looked out at the harsh landscape surrounding them. They had no food, little water, and Wicasa could barely walk. But the alternative was giving up, letting her father's murder go unpunished. We'll leave at sunset, she decided. If the ledger is there, we'll find a way to get it to someone who can act on it. There is one more thing, Wicasa said quietly. Your father was not the only one Calloway betrayed. There was a woman, Calloway's sister-in-law, an elderly Lakota woman named Iron Hawk. She helped your father hide the evidence, and she knows where it is hidden. If we can reach her, she can guide us to the ledger. And if we can't, then we'll die knowing we tried to honor your father's memory, Wicasa said. That's what he would have wanted. The journey to find Iron Hawk took them through terrain that seemed designed to test their resolve. They traveled by night, staying off the main trails using moonlight to navigate through rocky gullies and across stretches of hardpan that cracked under their horses' hooves. The pursuit was never far behind. They could hear the distant sound of hoofbeats echoing off canyon walls, see the faint glow of torches in the darkness. By the second night, they had reached the foothills where the landscape changed from open prairie to rolling hills covered with scrub oak and pine. Here, hidden in a grove of cottonwoods beside a seasonal creek, they found Iron Hawk's small cabin. The elderly woman emerged as they approached, her weathered face showing no surprise at their arrival. I have been expecting you, she said in accented English. Your father told me that someday his daughter would come seeking the truth. You knew my father? Jessie asked, dismounting from her weary horse. Thomas Harlow was a good man, Iron Hawk replied. He came to me when he realized he was dying, asked me to help him hide the evidence of his murder. I agreed because I knew that someday justice would be served. She helped Jessie get Wicasa down from his horse, noting the warrior's weakened condition with concern. You are hurt, nephew. Come inside. Let me tend to your wounds. The cabin was small but clean, furnished with traditional Lakota crafts and a few pieces of frontier furniture. Iron Hawk cleaned and rebandaged Wicasa's wound with practiced efficiency, then prepared a simple meal of bread and stew. As they ate, she told them about the ledger and the journey ahead. The line shack is 4 miles from here, hidden in the rocks below Eagle's Peak, she said. Your father chose it because it's defensible only one way in good view of the approaches. But that also makes it dangerous if you're discovered. Can you take us there? Jessie asked. I am too old for such a journey, Iron Hawk replied. But I have already sent word to the military fort, told them that injustice is being done and that soldiers may be needed. If you can reach the ledger and hold your position, help may come. And if it doesn't, then you will have honored your father's memory by trying, the old woman said simply. That is all any of us can do. They rested for a few hours, then set out before dawn. Iron Hawk provided them with food and water, and she gave Jessie a small bag of herbs that would help with Wicasa's pain. As they prepared to leave, She pressed a worn piece of paper into Jessie's hand. "Your father's last words," she said. "He made me promise to give this to you if you ever came looking for the truth." Jessie unfolded the paper and read the message written in her father's familiar handwriting. "My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, then the truth has finally come to light. I am proud of you for having the courage to seek justice even when it seemed impossible. Remember that honor is not about winning or losing, but about doing what is right, regardless of the cost. I love you always." Your father. Tears blurred Jessie's vision as she folded the paper and tucked it into her shirt pocket. Her father's words gave her strength for the dangerous journey ahead. The trip to the line shack took them through some of the most difficult terrain in the territory. Wicasa's wounded leg made riding increasingly painful, forcing them to stop frequently for rest. By midday, Jessie could see that he was failing. His face was gray with pain. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air, and his hands shook as he tried to grip his horse's reins. "We need to make a travois," she said, studying the terrain ahead. "You can't stay in the saddle much longer." "I can manage," Wicasa protested weakly. "No, you can't," Jessie replied firmly. "And I'm not losing you now, not when we're so close to the truth." She found suitable branches and fashioned a crude travois using rope and strips of cloth. It wasn't comfortable, but it would allow her to pull Wicasa across the rough terrain without putting weight on his wounded leg. The travois slowed their progress considerably, but it kept them moving when the warrior could no longer ride. As they approached the line shack, Jessie saw riders in the distance, at least a dozen men spread out in a search pattern, moving methodically through the terrain. Her heart sank as she realized what had happened. "They're here," she whispered. "Calloway's men. They're searching for us. Or for the ledger." Wicasa said weakly, "Perhaps they know what we seek." They waited in the shelter of some boulders, watching as the searchers moved through the area. But luck was with them. The riders were searching to the south, away from the line shack. After an hour, they moved on, leaving the area temporarily clear. "Now," Jessie said, helping Wicasa back onto the travois, "we move now while they're gone." The line shack was little more than a lean-to, constructed from rough-hewn logs and roofed with rusted tin. It looked abandoned, forgotten, exactly the kind of place where someone might hide important documents. Jessie helped Wicasa inside, then began searching for the hiding place her father had described. She found it beneath a loose floorboard in the corner, a wrapped bundle containing a thick ledger bound in black leather. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing pages filled with neat handwriting documenting every aspect of the horse-stealing operation. But it was the letter tucked inside the front cover that made her catch her breath. Written in her father's familiar hand, it told the entire story of his investigation, his discovery of Calloway's true identity, and the slow poisoning that was killing him. The medical reports were there too, detailed analyses of food and water samples showing traces of arsenic. But most shocking of all was the revelation of Calloway's past, how he had once saved Thomas Harlow's life during a mining accident in Colorado. How they had been close friends and partners, how greed and desperation had eventually turned Calloway into a murderer. "My friend became my killer," her father had written. "I cannot understand how a man who once risked his life to save mine could later take my life for money. But I document this truth so that justice may someday be served, and so that my daughter will know that I died fighting for what was right." Tears streamed down Jessie's face as she read the letter. The betrayal was even worse than she had imagined, not just murder, but the murder of someone who had once been loved and trusted. "We have what we came for," she told Wicasa. "Now we need to get it to someone who can act on it." But even as she spoke, she heard the sound that had been haunting her nightmares, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats too many to count, too close to avoid. Through the trees, she could see riders converging on the shack from all directions. "They found us," Wicasa said quietly. There is no escape this time. Jessie clutched the ledger to her chest, her mind racing. They were trapped, outnumbered, with nowhere to run. But they had the evidence, the proof of her father's murder and Calloway's crimes. Somehow they had to survive long enough to get it to the right people. Eagle's Peak, she said, pointing toward the rocky spire that rose above the grove. If we can reach the top, we can make a stand. Maybe hold them off long enough for help to arrive. It was a desperate plan, but it was their only chance. Supporting Wicasa between them, they began the treacherous climb up the old hunting trail that led to the summit. The path was narrow and steep, barely wide enough for single file, with loose stones that threatened to send them tumbling into the canyon below. Behind them, they could hear Calloway's men dismounting, their boots crunching on the rocky ground as they began their pursuit on foot. The deputy's voice carried clearly in the thin air. They're going up the old trail. Spread out and follow them. Nobody escapes this time. The climb was agony. Wicasa's wounded leg was barely functional, forcing him to rely on his arms and his good leg to haul himself up the steepest sections. Jessie found herself caught between helping him and protecting the ledger, the precious evidence that could bring justice for her father's murder. Halfway up the trail, they reached a narrow ledge that offered temporary shelter behind a cluster of boulders. Jessie risked a look back and saw their pursuers spread out below, methodically searching the terrain. Calloway himself was at the base of the trail, his face twisted with rage and desperation. I can see their tracks, he called to his men. They're going up to the peak. Stupid move, they've just trapped themselves. What do we do when we reach the top? Jessie whispered. We fight, Wicasa replied, pulling a knife from his belt. We make them pay for every step. They resumed their climb, moving as quickly as Wicasa's condition allowed. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous, with sections where they had to crawl across exposed rock faces while bullets whined off the stones around them. Jessie's hands were bloody, her knees scraped raw, but she kept the ledger pressed against her chest, protecting it with her body. As they climbed higher, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow from the high peaks. The air grew thin, making each breath a struggle. Wicasa was fading fast, his strength nearly gone, but he pressed on through sheer force of will, and not much farther. Jessie gasped, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to encourage him or herself. The top of Eagle's Peak was a small plateau, perhaps 50 yards across, surrounded by sheer drops on three sides. The only way up was the trail they'd just climbed, which meant they could control the approach, but it also meant they were completely trapped. The plateau was scattered with ancient stone cairns markers left by generations of Lakota who had used this place for vision quests and sacred ceremonies. The rocks provided excellent cover, and the position offered a commanding view of the approaches below. Now we make our stand, Jessie said, checking her father's Colt. She had 12 bullets, not nearly enough for the battle ahead. But as she looked out over the vast landscape stretching away toward the horizon, she saw something that made her heart leap. In the distance, perhaps 5 miles away, a column of dust was rising, too organized to be wild animals, too large to be anything but a substantial group of riders. They were moving fast, heading directly toward Eagle's Peak. Ironhawk kept her word. Wicasa said weakly, "Help is coming, but they're still far away." Jessie replied, "We have to hold until they arrive." The sound of boots on stone announced the arrival of their pursuers. Calloway's voice echoed up from the trail. "End of the line, folks. Nowhere left to run. We're not running anymore." Jessie called back, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "We have what we came for, and help is on the way." "Help." Calloway's laugh was harsh. "Who's going to help a horse thief and his accomplices? You're all alone up there, and you're all going to die." The first of his men appeared at the top of the trail, crouched low and moving fast. Jessie drew her father's Colt and fired the bullet, striking the man in the shoulder and spinning him around. He fell behind the rocks, cursing loudly. "She winged me," he shouted down to the others. "Got a good aim, too." "Then we do this the hard way," Calloway replied. "Rush them from multiple directions. They can't cover all approaches." What followed was the most terrifying hour of Jessie's life. Calloway's men came up the trail in waves, using the rocks for cover, forcing her to shift position constantly to avoid being flanked. She fired carefully, making every shot count, but there were too many of them. Her second shot took down another attacker. Her third wounded a man trying to circle around the eastern edge of the plateau. But for every man she hit, two more seemed to appear. The ancient stone cairns became her salvation. She moved from one to another, using them as cover, while she picked off the advancing men. Wicasa, despite his weakness, proved surprisingly effective with thrown stones. His aim was deadly accurate, and he managed to knock two men off the narrow trail, sending them tumbling into the canyon below. But the effort cost him dearly. His wound reopened, soaking his makeshift bandage with fresh blood. "I'm running low on ammunition," Jessie called to him as she ducked behind a cairn to reload. "Only 6 bullets left." "Then we must make them count," Wicasa replied, hefting another stone. The attackers were getting closer, more coordinated. Calloway had split them into 3 groups, one coming straight up the trail, the others trying to scale the cliff faces on either side. Jessie realized with growing dread that they were going to be overwhelmed. Her 7th shot missed its target. Her 8th grazed a man's arm, but didn't stop him. She was down to 4 bullets when disaster struck. A ricochet caught her in the left shoulder, spinning her around and sending her sprawling behind the rocks. Jessie. Wicasa struggled to reach her, but a bullet whined past his head, forcing him back into cover. The wound wasn't serious, but it was bleeding freely, and her left arm was nearly useless. She could hear the attackers getting closer, their voices filled with confidence as they sensed victory. "Got her," one of them shouted. "She's hit." "Or then finish this," Calloway's voice called from below. "I want that ledger, and I want them both dead." Jessie forced herself to sit up, her right hand still gripping the Colt. 3 bullets left. She had to make them count. A man appeared around the edge of a cairn, his rifle trained on her. She shot him in the chest, dropping him instantly. 2 bullets left. Another attacker came from the opposite direction, trying to catch her while she was distracted. Her shot caught him in the leg, sending him tumbling over the edge of the plateau. 1 bullet left. The sound of the distant cavalry was growing louder now, but they were still too far away. Jessie could see at least 6 men closing in on her position, with more behind them. 1 bullet against 6 men, the math was simple and terrifying. That's when Wicasa Red Hawk proved that courage wasn't measured by the strength of one's body, but by the strength of one's spirit. Despite his wounds, despite his weakness, he struggled to his feet and stepped into the open, drawing the attacker's fire. "Here," he shouted, waving his arms. "I am here." Bullets struck him in the chest and arm, but he remained standing, his warrior's courage undimmed. The distraction gave Jessie the precious seconds she needed to reach better cover, but it cost Wicasa dearly. He collapsed behind a cairn, blood spreading across his buckskin shirt. "You fool," Jessie whispered, crawling toward him. "You brave, noble fool." "The ledger," he gasped. "Save the ledger. Let my sacrifice mean something." Jessie looked around desperately. The attackers were closing in from all sides. She had 1 bullet left, and Wicasa was dying. The cavalry was still too far away to help. It seemed hopeless. Then she saw it, a loose stone, balanced precariously on the edge of the plateau, directly above the main trail. If she could reach it, if she could push it over, it might start a rock slide that would block the trail and buy them precious time. Leaving Wicasa behind the cairn, she crawled toward the stone bullets whining over her head. The attackers were focused on the position where she'd been hiding, giving her a few seconds of cover, but it wouldn't last long. She reached the stone just as one of the men spotted her. His rifle cracked the bullet, striking the rock inches from her head. But she was already pushing, using all her strength to dislodge the massive stone. It toppled over the edge with a thunderous crash, striking other rocks and starting exactly the kind of slide she'd hoped for. Boulders and debris cascaded down the narrow trail, forcing the attackers to flee or be crushed. The way up was blocked, at least temporarily. "You little bitch," Calloway's voice roared from below. "I'll kill you for that." But even as he shouted, the sound of cavalry bugles was growing louder. The column of dust was much closer now, close enough to see individual riders, close enough to recognize the blue uniforms and the American flag snapping in the wind. "Cavalry," one of the surviving attackers shouted. "Soldiers coming fast." "I can see that," Calloway snarled. "But they're too late. We finish this now." He appeared at the top of the trail, having climbed over the rock slide with 3 of his men. His face was bloody and dirt-stained, his eyes wild with rage and desperation. He had a rifle in his hands and murder in his heart. "You've caused me enough trouble, girl," he said, advancing slowly. "Time to pay the price." Jessie raised her father's Colt, her last bullet chambered and ready. But she was outnumbered 4-1, and her wounded shoulder made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Still, she wasn't going to die without a fight. "Before you kill me," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "I want to know why. Why did you murder my father? He saved your life once." Calloway's advance stopped, his face twisting with something that might have been regret. "Because he was going to destroy everything I'd built. All my plans, all my work ruined because he couldn't mind his own business. He was your friend. He was weak." Calloway spat. "Always talking about right and wrong, about doing the honorable thing. In this territory, honor gets you killed." "No," Jessie said firmly. "Honor gets you remembered. People like you are forgotten the moment you die." "Pretty words," Calloway sneered. "But they won't save you." He raised his rifle. But before he could fire, a new voice cut through the morning air, strong, authoritative, carrying the unmistakable ring of military command. "This is Captain Morrison, United States Cavalry. Drop your weapons immediately." The cavalry had arrived, their horses streaming onto the plateau like a blue tide. At their head rode a young officer whose face was grim with purpose. Behind him came 24 troopers, their carbines at the ready. Calloway's remaining men threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. But the deputy himself remained defiant, his rifle still trained on Jessie. "You're too late," he called to the soldiers. "This girl is a criminal, an accomplice to horse theft. I'm enforcing the law." "Not anymore," Captain Morrison replied, dismounting and approaching cautiously. "We've had reports of corruption in the territorial law enforcement. You're under arrest pending investigation." "You have no authority here," Calloway protested. "I'm a duly appointed deputy sheriff. And I'm a United States Army officer," Morrison replied coolly. "In matters of territorial security, my authority supersedes yours. Now drop your weapon." For a moment, it seemed as if Calloway might comply. Then his face twisted with final desperate rage. "If I'm going down, I'm taking her with me." But as he swung his rifle toward Jessie Wicasa, Red Hawk found one last surge of strength. Despite his wounds, despite his weakness, he launched himself at the deputy, his warrior's spirit burning bright in his final moments. The collision sent both men tumbling toward the edge of the plateau. Calloway's rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as he struggled to regain his balance. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as if both men would go over the edge. Then, Wicasa managed to grab hold of a rock outcropping, stopping his fall. But the effort reopened his wounds, and blood poured from his chest. He was fading fast, his strength nearly gone. "The ledger," he gasped to Jessie. "Show them the ledger." Jessie pulled the leather-bound book from her shirt and held it up for Captain Morrison to see. "This contains all the evidence," she said. Every stolen horse, every forged document, every payoff. And proof that Deputy Calloway murdered my father. The captain took the ledger and began reading, his expression growing darker with each page. The medical reports were particularly damning, clear evidence of arsenic poisoning administered over many months. Thomas Harlow's letter laid out the entire conspiracy in heartbreaking detail. My God, Morrison breathed. This is worse than we imagined. It's all lies. Calloway protested, struggling to his feet. Forgeries, fabrications. You can't trust the word of a dead man and a savage. We'll let a military tribunal decide that, Morrison replied. Sergeant placed this man under arrest. As the soldiers secured Calloway in shackles, Jessie knelt beside Wicasa Red Hawk. The warrior was dying, his life ebbing away with each labored breath. But his eyes were clear, and there was peace in his expression. We did it, she whispered. We got the evidence. Justice will be served. Your father would be proud, Wicasa said softly. You have honored his memory. You saved my life. Jessie replied, tears streaming down her face. Multiple times. I'll never forget that. Remember me to my people, Wicasa said. Tell them I died as a warrior should, fighting for what was right. His eyes closed and his breathing stopped. Wicasa Red Hawk, innocent of any crime, had given his life to expose the truth and protect the woman who had stood by him when no one else would. The military tribunal convened in the territorial capital 2 weeks later, presided over by Colonel William Hayes, a stern man with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be impressed by badges or false authority. The courtroom was packed with spectators, ranchers, townspeople, Indian agents, and representatives from the reservation who had come to witness the resolution of a case that had shaken the territory to its foundations. Jessie sat in the front row, the ledger open on her lap, watching as former Deputy Calloway was led to the defendant's table in shackles. The man who had terrorized her community for years looked smaller, somehow diminished by the weight of evidence and the certainty of justice. His expensive lawyer from Denver had already indicated that they would plead not guilty, but everyone in the courtroom knew it was a desperate gesture. The defendant is charged with multiple counts of murder, including the death of Thomas Harlow by arsenic poisoning. Colonel Hayes announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. Additional charges include horse theft, conspiracy forgery, and abuse of official authority. How does the defendant plead? Calloway's lawyer, a nervous man in an expensive suit, stood and cleared his throat. Not guilty to all charges, Your Honor. My client maintains his innocence and challenges the authenticity of the alleged evidence. It was a futile strategy. The evidence was overwhelming, not just the ledger, but testimony from captured accomplices, physical evidence recovered from raids, and most damning of all, the medical reports confirming Thomas Harlow's murder by slow poisoning. The trial lasted 5 days. Jessie testified about her father's mysterious illness, the strange medicine bottles, and the events leading up to the final confrontation. Her testimony was compelling, delivered with the quiet dignity of someone who had suffered greatly but refused to be broken by injustice. Iron Hawk spoke through an interpreter, describing Thomas Harlow's final visits to her home and his desperate attempts to gather evidence before his death. Her words carried the weight of absolute truth, and several jurors were visibly moved by her account. The prosecution methodically dismantled Calloway's defense, presenting forged credentials, fabricated references, and evidence of systematic corruption that had lasted for years. The medical testimony was particularly damning. 3 different doctors confirmed that Thomas Harlow had been slowly poisoned with arsenic, administered in doses calculated to mimic natural heart failure. On the 4th day, the prosecution called its star witness, one of Calloway's former accomplices, a man named Dutch Peterson, who had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. Peterson's testimony was devastating, describing in detail how Calloway had organized the horse-stealing operation and how he had slowly murdered Thomas Harlow when the rancher got too close to the truth. He was proud of it. Peterson said, his voice barely above a whisper. Said it was the perfect crime, killing a man with his own medicine, making it look natural. He laughed about it, said Harlow was too stupid to realize he was being poisoned. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs, forcing Colonel Hayes to call for order. Jessie felt tears streaming down her face as she finally heard the truth about her father's death, spoken aloud in a court of law. On the final day, Calloway himself took the stand in his own defense. It was a mistake that sealed his fate. Under cross-examination, he became increasingly agitated, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. Thomas Harlow was my friend, he admitted under oath. We worked together in Colorado, and yes, he saved my life during a mining accident. But that doesn't mean I owed him everything. When he started interfering with my business, when he threatened to destroy what I'd built, I had to protect myself. By murdering him, the prosecutor asked. By doing what was necessary. Calloway replied, his mask finally slipping completely. He was going to ruin everything. All my plans, all my work destroyed because he couldn't mind his own business. The confession hung in the air like a death sentence. Even his own lawyer looked stunned by the admission of guilt. The verdict was swift and unanimous, guilty on all counts. Colonel Hayes sentenced Calloway to death by hanging, with the execution to be carried out within 2 weeks. The accomplices who had testified against him received prison sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. As the court adjourned, Jessie felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back her father or restore Wicasa Red Hawk to life. Still, she had kept her promise to both men, had fought for the truth against overwhelming odds. The work of justice, however, was far from over. The ledger had contained the names of dozens of other criminals and corrupt officials throughout the territory. Over the following months, Jessie found herself at the center of a massive investigation that would reshape law enforcement across Kansas. Her first major case came just 2 weeks after Calloway's conviction. The ledger had implicated a ring of cattle rustlers operating out of Dodge City, led by a corrupt sheriff named Marcus Webb. Jessie rode to Dodge City with a squad of federal marshals, helping to arrest Webb and his accomplices in a pre-dawn raid that netted over 100 stolen cattle. The second case was more personal. The ledger revealed that Samuel Garrett, the rancher who had employed Jessie, had been buying stolen horses from Calloway's operation. Garrett had claimed ignorance, but the evidence showed he had known exactly what he was purchasing. His arrest was difficult for Jessie. He had given her work when she desperately needed it. But justice demanded that all criminals be held accountable. The third case involved a conspiracy to defraud the government of land grants intended for Indian reservations. Several territorial officials had been selling the land to white settlers while falsifying documents to hide the theft. The investigation led to the arrest of a dozen men, including 2 judges and a territorial legislator. Each case brought its own challenges and dangers. Jessie was threatened, shot at, and twice nearly killed by desperate criminals trying to silence her. But she pressed on, driven by her father's memory and her own unshakable sense of justice. The most satisfying moment came when she was able to return stolen horses to their rightful owners. 5 different families, 3 white and 2 Indian, had their animals restored to them along with financial compensation for their losses. The gratitude in their eyes made all the danger and hardship worthwhile. 6 months after Calloway's execution, Jessie received an unexpected visitor at her small office in the territorial capital. Governor Richards knocked on her door personally, carrying an official-looking document that would change her life forever. "Miss Harlow," he said, his face grave, but his eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "I have something that might interest you." He handed her the document, a letter from the President of the United States, written on official White House stationery. Jessie's hands trembled as she read the elegant script. "Miss Jessie Harlow, your extraordinary service to the cause of justice has come to my attention through reports from territorial officials and military commanders. Your courage in exposing corruption and your dedication to the rule of law exemplify the highest ideals of American citizenship. I hereby offer you a position as a special agent of the United States Department of Justice, with authority to investigate federal crimes throughout the Western Territories. This appointment, if accepted, would make you the youngest federal law enforcement officer in the nation's history. Your country has great need of citizens like you, and I hope you will accept this opportunity to serve justice on a larger stage. Respectfully, Ulysses S. Grant, President of the United States. Jessie read the letter twice, hardly believing the words. A federal agent. But I'm only 16 years old. Age is less important than character. Governor Richards replied, You've proven yourself capable of handling responsibility that would break men twice your age. The President recognizes that, and so do I. I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept. Richards encouraged. The territories need people like you, people who can't be bought, intimidated, or corrupted. People who will fight for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. Jessie walked to the window of her office, looking out at the bustling streets of the territorial capital. In the distance, she could see the prairie stretching away toward the horizon, vast and wild, and full of both promise and danger. Somewhere out there, other criminals were preying on innocent people, other injustices were being committed, other families were suffering as hers had suffered. I'll take the job, she said finally. But I have one condition. Name it. I want to visit my father's grave first. I want to tell him what we've accomplished. Governor Richards smiled. I think that's entirely appropriate. The cemetery on the outskirts of town was a peaceful place, shaded by cottonwood trees and surrounded by a low stone wall. Thomas Harlow's grave was marked by a simple headstone that read, Thomas Harlow, 1825-1871, beloved father and honest man. Someone had placed fresh wildflowers on the grave, probably Ironhawk, who visited regularly to pay her respects. Jessie knelt beside the grave and placed her hand on the headstone. We did it, Daddy, she whispered. We got them all. Calloway is dead, his accomplices are in prison, and the stolen horses have been returned to their owners. Justice has been served. She told him about the investigation, about the trials, about the dozen other criminals who had been arrested based on the evidence he had gathered. She told him about Wicasa Red Hawk's sacrifice, and about the federal appointment that would allow her to continue fighting for justice on a larger stage. I'm going to accept the President's offer, she said. I'm going to keep fighting for what's right, just like you taught me. I won't let your sacrifice be in vain. As she spoke, she felt a sense of peace settling over her. Her father's death had been avenged, his legacy secured. The work of justice would continue, but the burden of revenge was finally lifted from her shoulders. On her way back to town, she stopped at Ironhawk's cabin to say goodbye. The elderly woman was sitting outside working on a traditional beadwork design that told the story of Wicasa Red Hawk's courage. I'm leaving tomorrow, Jessie said. The President has offered me a position with the federal government. Ironhawk nodded approvingly. Your father would be proud, and my nephew's spirit will rest easier knowing that his sacrifice helped bring justice to the land. I'll never forget what you did for us, Jessie said. If you need anything, ever you have only to ask. I need nothing, Ironhawk replied. But I will remember your kindness, and I will tell my people that not all whites are like the ones who hurt us. Some, like you and your father, are people of honor. As Jessie prepared to leave, Ironhawk pressed a small leather pouch into her hands. Inside was a beautifully crafted arrowhead, carved from black obsidian and polished to a mirror shine. This belonged to Wicasa Red Hawk, the old woman said. It was made by his grandfather, who was a great warrior. Carry it with you and remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what is right despite that fear. Jessie tucked the arrowhead into her pocket next to her father's final letter. She would carry both with her as she embarked on this new chapter of her life. The next morning, she boarded the eastbound train that would take her to Washington, D.C. for her swearing-in ceremony. As the locomotive pulled away from the station, she pressed her face to the window and watched the Kansas prairie roll past. This land had taken everything from her parents, her home, her childhood innocence. But it had also given her something precious in return, and the knowledge that she could make a difference, that one person's courage could change the world. The train whistle echoed across the prairie, a lonesome sound that spoke of journeys begun and destinations unknown. But Jessie Harlow was no longer afraid of the unknown. She had faced her fears, conquered her enemies, and emerged victorious. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with the same courage and determination that had brought her this far. At 17 years old, she would become the youngest federal law enforcement officer in American history. But more than that, she would become living proof that justice could triumph over corruption, that truth could overcome lies, and that even the humblest person could make a difference in the great struggle between right and wrong. The train carried her toward her destiny, toward a future bright with possibility and purpose. Behind her, the Kansas prairie stretched away toward the horizon, vast and eternal, and full of the promise that tomorrow would be better than today. And somewhere in that vastness, the spirit of Thomas Harlow rested in peace, knowing that his daughter would carry on his fight for justice until her dying day. The story of Jessie Harlow was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning.